I'm going to pause it there, everybody, because I think a lot of people felt of a sensation, perhaps if you were around in the bicentennial, of a very different emotional zeitgeist, to reuse that perhaps trite phrase, trite term. This time versus when perhaps you were a child or something like that, because it was quite the feeling of a deflated balloon, the sense that, and I remember Donald Jeffries talking about this Saturday on America Unplugged, that there's a necessary third American Revolution, and he looked at Abraham Lincoln as the second American Revolution. I think different regimes have brought in these massive changes that have corrupted things all the way back to Alexander Hamilton replacing and usurping the Articles of Confederation and putting in the Constitution. And so later in the program, again, we're going to be talking about Jonathan Swift and his early 1700s warning against fiat currency and cronyism and things like that. Very interesting historical star to remember in the firmament of history there. But I do want to mention that this emotion, perhaps, that you were feeling as well, this sort of let down feeling of where did it all go wrong, as we think about and see these people who are seen as nothing more than diseases to be wiped out, like Operation Warp Speed, utterly dismissive of people's civil liberties or natural rights. Mark Levin calling it a great target with millions of people there. I mean, it just leaves you speechless. You just say, I don't understand it. But this is the mentality that I noted in that Planet of the Apes segment, where Dr. Zayas says that the humans are a danger and they need to be eliminated as quickly as possible. Mark Levin sees it as warfare, kinetic destruction. And yet, even in the United States, you have some people who might consider themselves to be very peaceful people. They're applauding aggression against you and me to take our money, to back a police force that will remove parents from kids, take people out of workplaces, literally pull people out of their apartments and their cars, going to the shopping mall, and throw them into places like CCOT where they'll be tortured, regardless of the destination. How about the taking of those people is wrong? How about the taking of the money of all those people who have to pay for this is wrong? That allows us to look back at history. It allows us to think about something that I'm going to mention a little bit later about the Alien and Sedition Acts, plural. And it allows us to think about what was, and I've got it in a bit of a book here. I want to read you a segment from this about Thomas Jefferson and his battle against the Alien Act and against the Sedition Act. But what was the battle at the time of the founding era about immigrants that exposes to us just how incorrect the current regime of centrally planned, government-run immigration policy is? Now, some people might see what's going on the screen and say, Guard, you're talking about the Iranian situation. I'm talking about treating human beings as non-human. And it gives us the opportunity now to bring in our guest, who is a scholar, a real, just absolute energy source for freedom. He's Jacob Hornberger. We're going to go to our mind meld right now and get logical, as Supertramp might say, but as the Vulcans say, it's time for our Liberty Conspiracy Mind Meld. And we're going to discuss a piece that I posted numerous times and got some great responses from people who understand the golden rule. Let's join Jacob Hornberger on Liberty Conspiracy.
I must try to mind meld with it.
Eternity ends.
Our minds are merging, Doctor. Our minds are one. I feel what you feel. I know what you know.
All right. right, let's bring him in. And he is a man who is always working towards allowing people to understand the essence of freedom. He's Jacob Hornberger. Jacob, welcome to the post-Independence Day recap and looking towards the future episode of Liberty Conspiracy. How are you, my good friend?
Well, I always get a headache when you do that darn mind meld card.
I know. It's if only we had some of that green Vulcan blood, we'd probably be a lot better off.
I'm doing well, and thank you to having me back on your great show. I need it periodically to charge up my batteries because you're one of the few libertarians who really understands what libertarianism is all about. And it's great to be here. It's an honor to be here.
Oh, it's great. I was thinking about you over the weekend, Jacob, and I'm thinking about being a kid and the bicentennial and so on. And we're a few years apart, not that many, and you got to be a little bit older when the bicentennial came around, and perhaps you had less of a charge to it. Maybe you weren't as excited about it as I was, but I was absolutely thrilled. I had to carry around an American flag as a little kid at school. I was in the wool outfit from the colonial era, and I had the hat and all this stuff. I had to recite, unfortunately, the Gettysburg Address, and then I learned a little bit more about Abraham Lincoln. But I think the process of growing up and starting to recognize that some of the things that my teachers had taught me and some of the things that they adored might not have been exactly right. And the lessons that are there are very strong lessons, and there are positive lessons to a lot of these things, even as we look at some of the really, really dark things that are happening out there. And I thought that this piece, and I want to turn to the news notes where I've posted it again for the folks who are the subscribers at my Substack. I thought you hit two parallel channels with that piece that you released about Independence Day and immigration. And you have another new one out there that I also posted today. So I'm going to scroll down on the news notes here and just get down to the bottom. You can see there's a ton of information here. And so we've got the immigration police state, Hannah Dugan's poor situation in Wisconsin, a lot more. And then I wanted to discuss this one sort of to bring this in. It's a sentimental story, but it has to do with a mariachi star playing Star Spangled Banner in ICE detention on July 4th. We'll discuss that if you want to. I'll just show what the headline looks like here. And you can see he's 20 years old. He was 4 when he arrived in the U.S., and his family fled violence in Mexico. On Thursday, as ICE commemorated the country's independence, Hebert Castro belted out a rendition of the national anthem alongside a display of fellow detainees' red, white, and blue handkerchiefs, according to the San Antonio Express. Now, I know that, having grown up in that area, and you've told us stories about seeing some of the guys on your farm, I can imagine how it must hit you sentimentally to see any of these people in whatever generation having their lives disrupted like this. And that's why I thought it was interesting, because when you wrote about the Declaration of Independence versus America's immigration police state, which is right here, you hit two themes. One of them is a very interesting sentimental theme. It incorporates, and let me know if I'm off base here, but it incorporates patriotism, the theme of the weekend, the theme of the era, and your own sort of, what I took from it was a sort of personal reflection mixed with some hard-hitting real-world information. Can you tell us what inspired you to write this piece, Jacob, that was released on the 2nd of July?
Well, as you know, I grew up on the border in Laredo, Texas. I spent almost half my life there on the border. I experienced this police state. At the bicentennial, I guess, which was 1976, is that right? I was 26, and I had not discovered libertarianism. But I was a Democrat. I'd grown up a Democrat, and I believed in the welfare state. I couldn't understand why people would object to the government helping the poor. But there was something about the immigration control system that I instinctively knew was wrong. I didn't know it from a libertarian standpoint, but I knew it was wrong. And when I went back to Laredo, I started writing some essays on why it was just wrong. And it was like a multi-part series. And I went over to the local convenience store by my house, a 7-Eleven or one of those. And I said, can I put these out for people to pick up? And it was the first time I'd ever tried anything writing. I was a lawyer, but writing in this kind of sense. And he says, yeah, okay, much to my surprise. And so I put out part 1, came back a week later, and I think I put out about 50 copies. And he says, the same guy, he says, you need to bring more copies. Those were all taken. And so, and then I asked the federal judge there in Laredo, I said, I'd like to be appointed to represent illegal immigrants for free because this whole system really sucks from a constitutional standpoint. And he said, fine. And so, and if you point out, when I was growing up on my farm in Laredo, the Border Patrol trespassed onto our property without a warrant, which they had the authority to do. It was located on the river, Rio Grande. And they busted our workers. And it was a very traumatic experience for my brothers and me. So when I look at the Declaration of Independence, those words really mean a lot to me. I mean, I think that's really the real significance of Independence Day. It's not the military battles. It's not the secession from Britain. It's those words that Jefferson wrote that said, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are natural God-given rights. They adhere to everybody, not just Americans, not just to British, to everyone, including foreigners. The pursuit of happiness. It's a natural God-given right. Well, if it's a right, that means government can't touch it. And Jefferson points out, government's job is to protect the exercise of these rights. And yet, here we are living in a society where those words are being violated every single day by ICE and the Border Patrol and this whole immigration police state apparatus. It's just bizarre. In fact, I feel like I'm living in Bizarro World, which is a part of the Superman DC Comics thing.
The backwards S on your chest, right?
Yeah. Everything's upside down. You've got the U.S., President Trump declaiming against communism when he's over there partnering with a communist regime in Venezuela, and the right wing just treats it all as normal. And I'm sitting there saying, oh my gosh, this is a weird society in which we live. So that's why I love coming on your show, because I feel pretty normal when I come over here.
Well, it's a wonderful feeling too, Jacob, because, I sincerely appreciate, it's like a breath of fresh air. As you know, sometimes when you're doing this work, there's such an assault of information that you could just go on and on all day, and you have to know when to stop so that you can get some of the information out, and then you sort of collect the backlog and try to sift out what you can do there. And every once in a while, that sort of a lemonade stand of somebody offering you something on this great long distance run or something like that is terrific. And I really appreciate even more the effort that you put into that has led me to pursue these sorts of things. And in that piece, and I put it up on the screen, where you said, in other words, everyone in the world has the natural God-given rights to sustain his life through labor, to freely travel and move. Jefferson explained this so well. And to pursue happiness in his own way, a peaceful way. No government, not even the U.S. government, wields the legitimate authority to infringe, control, destroy, regulate, manage, or direct rights that are bestowed on people by nature and God. And you mentioned Laredo. Those people who trespassed on your property because you were next to the river, they claimed the authority. They didn't have any authority. No one can claim the authority to trespass on your parents' property. No one can claim that authority, and yet they did. And the other thing that gets me is, if we look at the long train of abuses that are listed, one of those cars on the train of abuses was the kangaroo courts. And here today, not only do they have kangaroo courts where they're taking people away, they don't even provide the courts. They send them to a CCOT prison, and they don't even get a kangaroo court. That's how bad it is now. It's crazy.
Oh, it's like living in a totalitarian regime. It really is. I'd like to share with you a personal story, if you don't mind. That you reminded me of it when you cited this guy that was singing a Star Spangled Banner inside the prison. So if I could take a moment to tell you this personal story.
Sure.
So I was representing these illegal immigrants for free, and which entailed going out to the detention center, which was located a little bit out of town, to visit with my clients. And so when I was out there one day, I saw about 100 guys walking around in khakis. That was their kind of the standard garb they had, and they looked pretty depressed. This was around right before Christmas time. So I called the sheriff, who is a friend of mine, and I said, Mario, I'd like to do a Christmas show for the illegal immigrants. Have I told you the story before?
No,
Okay.
This is cool.
I'd like to do a Christmas show for the illegal immigrants. Oh, that would be fantastic. Great. Okay, so I contacted my cousin, Mike, who had been playing guitar since he was a little kid and was now at the University of Texas as a student. Mm-hmm. And later made his career doing a band, playing old classic rock and roll. So this is how good this guy was. So I said, hey, Mike, I want to do a show for the illegal immigrants. When you come home for Christmas, would you be willing to do this, sing some songs there? He goes, oh, yeah, just let me know the date. Great. So we had this all planned out in advance. So we arrived there, and they've got a makeshift stage for us that was outdoors. This is an outdoor encampment with sort of a barracks. You kind of got the impression it was like a Nazi camp because they had barbed wire on the top with towers looking down and stuff. And but there was like about 100 chairs there. And all of a sudden, these guys, they had nothing else to do. They start filling up the chairs. And so we had a captive audience. And so I welcomed them in Spanish, and my cousin speaks Spanish. So he started singing songs in Spanish, Christmas songs, old classics of Mexico. And, Cielito Lindo and all the songs these guys recognized.
Nice.
And you could see her tears welling up in their eyes. This was like a few days before Christmas. And so Mike sang for about, half an hour, 40 minutes or so. And then by prearrangement, he says, Jacob, my throat's bothering me a little bit. I need a rest. Can you take over here? I said, yeah, sure. Well, I can't sing a note, but I can give a speech.
Oh.
So I said to these guys, I said, let me tell you something. You're here in jail. I understand that. But never for a moment think that you're a criminal, because you're not. The criminals are the federal judges, the federal prosecutors, and the federal guards that keep you here. What you're doing is simply fulfilling God's will. You're exercising fundamental, natural, God-given rights. You're supporting your family. You're through labor, through contract with employers that want to hire you. There's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong is that you're in jail because of that. So never, ever feel guilty about what you've done, because you've done nothing wrong. The people who have put you here, they're the ones that are engaged in wrongdoing. Well,
that's for sure.
These guys' eyes were this big. I mean, huge. So then I said, hey, Mike, are you ready? So Mike starts to sing another couple of songs. But at this point, and this is all on microphone and everything, there's guards starting to come to the stage because they had heard what I had to say.
Really?
Oh, yeah. So
Wow.
It was clear. It was clear the message was that it was time to wrap up. And
Wow.
But these guys, as we wrapped up, I said, thank y'all for coming. They had the biggest grins on their faces. They were the happiest guys. We had made Christmas for these guys.
Isn't that something? And
great.
that sort of sentiment, that moment of action on your part probably stuck with many of those guys and maybe inspired them to do something. And, whether it's about that subject or it's just doing something else for somebody in their family or somebody at a workplace, maybe they stuck up for somebody. That's awesome, Jacob. That is so great. You and Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison. That's it.
One of my fondest memories when I see this guy singing the Star Spangled Banner in the penitentiary, and or these detention centers. Some of these people have died in these detention centers.
Absolutely. I think I was looking at the numbers last year. I think there were over 30 people who died either directly or in custody of ICE. Because they didn't get medicine, they didn't get cancer treatments, whatever it might be. Mysteriously, suddenly they just broke out in a spontaneous, cranial injury that just, who knows how that possibly happened. These sorts of things, obviously from beatings. And it's just incredible to think that the system not only has so many people supported that. I'll give you an example. There's a Boston radio host named Jeff Cooner, and I mention him sometimes here because when I get up at 6 o'clock or so, he's starting. And I called his show one time because he was talking about due process and how it's ridiculous to think that these guys should be getting due process. And I called in, I was like, listen, this is like the mechanic's guide to the machine that they built. The machine is run by the Constitution. You don't operate it any other way. You don't shift from first to fifth immediately. It's going to stall. It doesn't work like that. This is built this way. It doesn't matter whether the machine is applied to Americans on the continent of the United States or people who are visiting. This is the due process that is supposed to be available for everybody because it's based on natural rights. So he says, well, only Americans get natural rights. Get natural rights. So guess what? Guess what he was talking about Friday and today? The Declaration of Independence, the God-given natural rights that Thomas Jefferson and John Locke brought up. I almost called him up and said, dude, could you play the conversation that we had a few months ago? Because you are a towering hypocrite. Just unbelievable. Do you have any concept of anything that if somebody happens to remember our conversation, they're going to recognize that you just completely flipped about natural rights? Now you're saying there are natural rights. It was amazing. It was amazing. And this is, I think, just to bring it back, this, I think, is the mindset of many people who look at the ends justifying the means. They think that it's okay to skirt the rules to get X or Y done. And I was chatting with my friend Eric Peters last week on Monday about how left-wingers will say, it's not right to take someone's life, to engage in kinetic warfare overseas. And, some might even mention there's no declaration of war, but, they understand at least the basics of, the evils of warfare. And then they say we should take that money and send it over to this welfare scheme or this or that, and or green technology for the future, as they say. And I said, don't you understand? You're the wings on the same predator bird. Like, you just stop doing that. It's not your money. It's not you're assuming for somebody else how their time is now yours to do with what you want. To me, it's very basic. It's just, you either are left alone or somebody's preying on you. It's like Edmund Kontowski said in that book, Makers and Takers, years ago. There are either makers or there are predators, and that's all.
Yeah, you make two good points here, and that is that there's so many Americans that cannot conceive of the fact that people have a right, natural God-given right, to keep everything they earn. That they don't even realize that Americans live without an income tax and an IRS for more than 100 years.
Right.
Because when they were celebrating the 4th of July in, let's say, 1882, they were celebrating a way of life in which there was no income tax or IRS. Totally different concept of freedom. Here, it's like you point out, it's just assumed that government owns a certain amount of people's income, and whether it's going to be directed to an overseas military escapade or to a welfare state subsidy, whatever.
Yeah.
It's the government's money to give away. And the other thing that the point I want to make here on the immigration issue is on the Constitution is that, as I point out in the article, the Constitution did not provide the federal government with the power to regulate immigration. In fact, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, one of the reasons for the break with England, it was really a war of secession, was immigration controls that King George had placed on the colonists. They were furious about it. So it stands to reason that when they enacted the Constitution, there was no immigration controls, not until the so-called Ellis Island system that came with this brutal Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882.
Yes.
Americans started doing this. In fact, even if you look at after the end of the Mexican War in 1848, when the United States essentially stole the entire northern half of Mexico, there was open borders between Mexico and the United States where people were free to cross back and forth for at least 50 years. The Border Patrol wasn't even established till 1924.
Oh, it's incredible. And I think you're the only guest I've ever had on this show who has mentioned the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. After, of course, the 1875 Qilong v. Freeman decision, which was an utter act of disrespect towards what is written in the Constitution, what is not written in the Constitution. And I have an open challenge to anyone. I will pay them $1,000 if they can find the word immigration in the U.S. Constitution. They'll find naturalization, but they won't find immigration, as Jefferson spelled out in Kentucky Resolution number 4 in 1798, and as Madison spelled out in the Virginia Resolve the same week. In fact, they say, I believe it was Jefferson who wrote it, and it was Madison who published it. And in fact, I would like, if I can, to bring in something, Jacob.
Teach me about that Qilong decision. I'm not sure. I'm not aware of that.
So what happened was in California in 1772, I think it was, California, as was their wont, passed what I think is a terrible idea, but you can see what generated it. They had their own California Chinese Exclusion Act. And of course, San Francisco, very well known, a lot of Asians coming in. We had the cook on Bonanza, whatever the guy's character's name was. They incorporated all that stuff with a lot of the Asian migrants who came in. And the reason they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act then ostensibly was they wanted to stop Asian women because they said they were becoming prostitutes and they might be carrying diseases. And of course, we all know that really they were trying to stop Asian anybody because they didn't want them to compete for the jobs and do what they thought would be lowering wages, which of course, if you can lower labor expenses, that leaves more money left over for consumers not to have to spend as much and labor as much to get what they wanted. Now they have money left over. The whole free market economic things works. But so they passed that in 1872. And in 1875, it was challenged in the case called Qilong v. Freeman, ChyLung v. Freeman. And in 1875, the Supreme Court ruled just out of nowhere. They didn't even quote the Constitution. They just said, and it's astounding when you read this, it's one of the worst decisions ever. It's as bad as Roe versus Wade. It's worse than Roe versus Wade, because at least Roe versus Wade had a really bad precedent just before that, a few years before that, about the penumbra, right? This one, they just said, well, it's obvious Congress has purview over immigration. It's astounding. And so from that point on, the hot potato was in the hands of the centralizers in Washington, and then Ellis Island comes up. And then in 1882, ironically, California passed its own Chinese Exclusion Act, right? The people who challenged it didn't want that act. So the Supreme Court finds against California, strikes the act, says that it's a federal purview, and then a few years after that, in 1882, just what you're saying, the nation state in Washington passes their own version of what the people had opposed in California anyway. So they made it even worse.
That's fascinating. I didn't know about that. Well, and there's the Page Act, 1874, I believe, that was simply a mirror image of what California had enacted.
Yeah. That's
Asian women because of prostitution and disease.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I wanted to bring this up, and you're probably familiar with this. If we can sort of diverge for a second here into some bookland, Jacob. As you know, Dumas Malone, he wrote this multi-volume series on Jefferson and his life, and in it is very interesting. I just want to read this. And sorry, I'm sniffling like crazy here. I must be allergic to something. We have a new cat. I don't think it's the new cat, but I've been stuffed up for days here. This is very interesting. This is volume, I don't even know what volume this is, but this Jefferson as vice president. Of the four measures commonly included under the designation of the Alien and Sedition Acts, only one was contingent on a declaration of war. This was the Alien Enemies Act, authorizing, which of course Trump is trying to use now, even though there's no declared war, authorizing the deportation of citizens or subjects of countries with which the United States was actually at war. It was voted and approved after Jefferson left Philadelphia, and he took no exception to it. Although it commanded bipartisan support, it was in its final form essentially a Republican measure to which the extreme Federalists were indifferent. And this is quite interesting. There was no need to use it in this period since war was not declared. But this justifiable measure, which was without limit of time, remained on the statute books. None of the other acts could have been passed except under conditions of fear and patriotic hysteria. One perfervid anti-Gallican wrote George Washington that he looked upon war as necessary against France, of course, or against England, to enable us to lay our hands on traitors. Failing to get war, the extremists were nonetheless able to exploit war psychology for domestic political purposes. Politics was obvious in the Naturalization Act, which extended the requirement for the attainment of citizenship by immigrants from 5 to 14 years, the maximum for the whole of American history. So, of course, at that time, the difference between John Adams and Jefferson was Adams was much more aligned with the Brits and the Eastern Bloc of industrialists and the banks from England. Jefferson thought that America owed a great deal of courtesy and thanks to the French, and the French and the English were at war. So John Adams gets the Alien and Sedition Acts passed, and part of the Alien Act was, as they note here, to try to stop Whigs from coming in. They didn't want radical Whigs coming in who were very much in favor of individual natural rights. So it goes into a couple other things here, but I'll just mention, palpably political as the Naturalization Act was, the Alien or Alien Friends Act disturbed Jefferson far more deeply because of the arbitrary power it conferred on the president. This measure started in the Senate, and besides hearing the discussion there, he could not have failed to be familiar with the debate in the House, which occurred before he left town. He described the bill as, quote, a most detestable thing, end quote. And even after it had been modified beyond his expectations, he said that it would place under absolute government all aliens not protected by treaties. In a nutshell, the act authorized the president to, sorry, just got to flip the page here, deport any alien he thought dangerous. As Edward Livingston of New York said in the House, exciting the suspicions of the president was the new crime. One of the persons against whom Jefferson thought the law directed was the French philosopher Volney. Writing his son-in-law, Jefferson said, "It suffices for a man to be a philosopher and to believe that human affairs are susceptible to improvement and to look forward rather than backward to the Gothic ages for perfection, to mark him as an anarchist, disorganizer, atheist, and enemy of the government." Volney, end quote, Volney, erstwhile guest of Monticello, sailed off ahead of time with a boatload of French. Among them was Victor Marie Dupont, who had been named consul general, but those credentials Adams would not recognize. The president later signed a blank warrant to be used against the man's father, Jefferson's friend Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours, in case he should come to the United States, a thing which this founder of a famous family did not do as yet. Afterwards, Jefferson regarded Joseph Priestley, the English scientist and Unitarian clergyman, as a likely victim, and to him in due course he described the Alien Act as, quote, libel on legislation. And the final thing I'll mention here is this. Hamilton. Though Hamilton objected to none of the arbitrary features of the act and believed that the mass of aliens should be obliged to leave the country, he originally wanted favor to be shown merchants and exceptions made to a few others whose demeanor had been irreproachable, according to him. The Republicans in Congress opposed this bill primarily on constitutional grounds. There is no way of knowing whether Jefferson had any direct part in determining their policy. And they go into a few other things, but Hamilton wanted Jefferson's friends kept out. Hamilton did not like the idea of anybody close. He was like Adams. He didn't want anybody close to Jefferson coming in, supporting Jefferson in any way whatsoever. And you can just see how this is all manifested today. I mean, if you speak up for due process, if you talk about this Judge Hannah Dugan in Wisconsin and how they presented her with a completely bogus slip of paper that they called an immigration warrant, an executive administrative warrant. How can you get a warrant if it's not from a judge, a real judge? It is all coming back today. It's the same game that they're playing today. It's incredible.
It really is. I mean, it has all the hallmarks of what Jefferson would have described as a tyrannical society. It's much worse than what they rebelled against. I mean, what King George was doing was insignificant compared to what the federal government is doing. It's quite ironic, especially when you combine it with the drug war. I mean, did you ever think you'd see the day when federal officials would just be assassinating people who were suspected of possessing or distributing or transporting drugs? I mean, it's so shocking and so mind-boggling. And what's equally shocking and mind-boggling is the normality of it all. It's just become the new normal. Oh, they killed a few more people in the boat in the Caribbean today. Oh, it's up to 200 now. Oh, well, yawn, yawn. This is out and out murder, Guard. I mean, just murder. Yeah.
I asked the audience before you joined in the back room, Jacob, and it's a very strange sensation. I don't know how you feel about it. But being on a stream like this, opening up the subject in conversation rather than just over a phone. Don't mind me if I do. But when I saw Donald Trump, 20 years ago, I just thought of him as sort of a buffoony, sort of comical character, and I didn't think too much about it. But now he's a mass murderer. And I don't understand how people can't understand that he is not only a mass murderer, but all the soldiers who answered his commands are murderers as well. And they implicate all of us. And, I think people excuse this when it gets this patina of so-called normalcy from government. Maybe I don't understand how they can block it away when it's done through the government. I don't get it.
I think it's the banality of evil that it just becomes normalized because the federal government's doing it. If the federal government's doing it, then it must be okay. And there's that deference to authority. And I really don't think that Trump is the root of the problem. I think it's just these evil systems that have become part of the federal government. And the drug war is right there at the top of these evil systems. I used to think that maybe these guys were just ignorant when we would argue that that's the cause of the violence and the drug cartels, the drug war brings them into existence. Why couldn't they see that? I mean, it's just so plain to me that if you want to get rid of the cartels, you just legalize drugs, just like legalizing alcohol got rid of the Al Capone gangs and the violence and so forth. But it finally occurred to me, they understand this. They want the drug war as a means of control, of power that they are able to exercise not only over Americans, but around the world. Look how they justified that military attack on Maduro. They killed 100 people there under what guise? The drug war. And so they love the drug war. They know that it'll go on forever. They know the average American will support it because the average American is opposed to drugs and thinks that the drug war will finally be won one of these days. And that it just is their opportunity to exercise power over the serfs here in the United States.
That's it. And it's very interesting, too, because you probably have known people who've gone into the military or the FBI, or, sometimes you hear about somebody from high school. Oh, I think he's working for the CIA, or whatever. And I suppose at a young age, people think that they're doing the right thing for, the nation state, and that it's emblematic and represents certain things. But I think that you can see this manifested in so many people, whether it's Anthony Aguilar or it's our friend Tony Arterburn, who was in Iraq, and, other people who've come back from Afghanistan, or, folks who got sent off to Vietnam, and they come back and say, what are we doing? What are we doing? And that's the end result, the immorality of occupation and crushing of rights and taking of lives and taking of opportunities. But it's this unseen stuff. It's like what Bastiat said, the seen and the unseen. And I think Bastiat expressed it very well with his expression about statism. The state is that great fiction by which everyone endeavors to live off of everyone else. It is always the tragedy of the commons. And I see this demonization and dehumanization of people like Kilmar Abrigo Garcia or Hannah Dugan, a judge, who he had a right to be left alone. And she was just trying to do her job. And she rightly called him then the way the system works. And she said, no, you're trying to go from first gear into a gear that doesn't exist. This is not a real warrant. So come back with a real warrant. And she was right. She was upholding something that I thought people puffed up and felt good about on the 4th of July. This standard that all those people who came before us fought so hard to defend, whether it was the standard of opposing kangaroo courts and Nathan Hale starts to fight for the revolution, whether it's opposing the corporatism of the British East India Tea Company in the harbor of Boston, Massachusetts in December, and throwing the tea over there, overboard. Whatever it was, these sentimental feelings are translated into this perverse monster that we see a guy like Mark Levin looking at a snapshot of a million people in a square in Tehran saying, a prime target, opportunity lost. That's like, what are you talking about? That's insane.
It's incredible.
I don't understand it.
It's incredible. I'm really surprised that the U.S. government and the Israeli government didn't attack that crowd. I mean, I wouldn't have been surprised at all if they had done that. It was a prime opportunity for them to kill a lot of people. And your point about soldiers obeying orders is absolutely valid. These soldiers that have blindly obeyed orders, they are engaged in murder. There is no justification for it. I'm sure they're thinking that Trump will pardon them if they're prosecuted, but who's going to prosecute them? This is a government that wields omnipotent totalitarian-like powers. They can kill whoever they want. All they have to do is label them a terrorist, a communist, a drug dealer, and they can kill them. And on American soil, too. Don't think that's limited to the Caribbean. That's a message to everybody. This is the system that you now live under. Get used to it, because there's not a darn thing that you can do about it.
And I don't know about you, Jacob, but the bright spots that I find are, the conversations I used to have with my dad or my mom and you and other people, Sheldon, Richard, whoever might be there, Jim Bovard, Robert Higgs, meeting some of these people, Mary Ruwart, just wonderful folks, especially here in New Hampshire with the Free State Project, as you know, and people who pick up on some of these things. And you did this on your other piece. I want to turn to this before we depart, which is, I'm not going to show the piece yet, but I want to show part of the puzzle here. Trump touts American golden age attacks communism, which has been their theme, their PR theme over the past 2 weeks, the anti-communist idea, because, of course, people like Mondami and others are being elected, and they call themselves social democrats or communists or whatever. And there's room to be analytical about their ideas on government-run supermarkets and rent freezes, and all those things provide great lessons, obviously. But Donald Trump railing against collectivists under the communist banner sort of misses a lot of his social welfare and military welfare, which is an extension of communism to other countries, and his utter fascism. And you wrote another really good piece, and people can go to FFF.org to check that out. Why don't you tell people about that one? What's Trump's beef with communism?
Well, it really makes no sense because, as I pointed out in the piece, Trump fell in love with the communist dictator of North Korea in his first term. Those are his terms that he wrote, that Kim Jong-un sent him beautiful letters, and that Trump fell in love with him. This guy's a brutal communist dictator. Okay, but then we've got Venezuela. This is the most shocking thing, I think, of foreign policy that maybe I've seen in the entire history of me as a libertarian, because it's so weird. You've got this socialist communist regime headed by a woman with a strong Marxist background, worked for Hugo Chavez, Nicolas Maduro. She was vice president of Maduro. She's a longtime member of the Socialist League of Venezuela or something. And Trump is working with her and partnering with her and praising her, saying she's doing a terrific job, and dissing the people who defeated Maduro in the election. The only reason Maduro was able to stay in it is because he had the military and intelligence forces, because they're a national security state like the U.S. is. And so they oust Maduro, but I'm not saying they should have done a regime change operation, but that doesn't mean you have to work with these people. Leave it to Venezuela to handle this thing. But with Trump dissing the opposition, which is about 90% of the population, I mean, to me, this thing is a formula for really combustibility here. Something's going to blow up, because now you've got this earthquake down there, and people are dissatisfied. They're starting to protest. They won't let Maria Corina Machado, who's the leader of the dissidents, return to Venezuela, where they have 400 dissidents still in prison under this Trump partnership, or this regime that Trump is partnered with, to be more exact. It's just bizarre.
Well, one of the things that strikes me about that, Jacob, is it seems like it's part of a giant mosaic that they're trying to put together. If you look at things like the Zedes in Honduras, where Trump releases, what's his name, Romeo, whatever his name is, the former president of Honduras, who had been put in under drug charges while Trump is killing people, claiming that they're funneling drugs to the United States. He releases this guy. Well, he was very pro Zedes, this whole thing about basically the government of Honduras taking people's land through eminent domain and then giving it to giant corporations like Palantir or others for very inexpensive. And then those people claiming that it's a free market experiment when really it's more fascism, not free markets, and having the local people work there, taking advantage of a lot of the natural resources there and so on. And so that seems to be tied with Venezuela, also their desire to overthrow Cuba. And there are reports now. In fact, Karen Carpenter put it on the screen. She goes, any news on reports that the grid is down in Cuba? For the past, I think, 4 hours or so, they don't have any power in Cuba. And Marco Rubio is intimately tied in with some very strong forces out of Honduras, of course, Cuban exiles. As much as people might not like Fidel Castro, having commercial blockades against being able to trade with people in Cuba, labeling those guys the bad guys while you're pointing guns at American consumers to say you can't deal with somebody in Cuba, is a bit hypocritical. And they want to overthrow Cuba. And it seems like the Venezuela thing, to control that oil, to get basically Chevron a special deal because they're friends with Donald Trump. It's all very, very corrupt. It's unbelievable. And I think a lot of it has to do with trying to overthrow Cuba.
Oh, there's no question. I mean, they're still fighting the Cold War. The national security establishments never got over the Bay of Pigs and their failure to assassinate Castro. But here's the really weird part. They've got this oil blockade. It targets the Cuban people with death. That's what they're trying to do. They're killing Cuban people, which are in the middle of a vice with socialism and the blockade. But that's what they were doing in Venezuela for decades. They were targeting the Venezuelan population with that oil embargo, just like they're doing, and all the sanctions, just like they're doing with the Cuban people. The people they were trying to kill are now being treated like the enemy. And the people that they were trying to oust from power with the sanctions that were killing people in the population, they're now the fair-haired people, the partners. Right. I mean, the whole thing is topsy-turvy. But I know we're going to wrap up, but let me give you what I'm inspired by. And lately, I'm inspired by our American ancestors in the late 1800s. I've been doing a lot of studying about them and watching YouTube videos, because this was a totally different way of life. And the reason it's so inspiring for me is because those people showed what's possible. Now, it wasn't a libertarian panacea. I don't want anybody to think that. The statists were making inroads, the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Ellis Island immigration control system. But if you look at this way of life, it was really unusual, Guard. No income tax, no IRS, no Federal Reserve, no paper money, no national security state, no Pentagon, CIA, NSA, FBI, no Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare state, public schooling, effectively no immigration controls yet. Yeah, they had the Chinese Exclusion Act, but 98% of Europeans were free to come. And the result was this unbelievable society of prosperity and inventions. This is where I'm looking at all the YouTube videos. All these immigrants who were the dregs of society. I mean, this was Emma Lazarus' poem about give us your homeless, your tempest-tossed people that would never be accepted today. They were coming over here inventing things. I just saw a YouTube video on Schwinn bicycles. The Schwinn was the famous bicycle company of the 1950s. When I was a kid, 1960s, right. He was a German immigrant. And if you look at all these other guys like Dale Carnegie, he was either an immigrant or children of immigrants who grew up poor. J.P. Morgan, all these guys, all these inventions that were coming into play. It had to be the most exciting time in history. There were inventions every day, the automobile, the incandescent light bulb. And it was because of this unusual society where people were, in an economic sense, the freest they've ever been in history. That's what inspires me. They showed it's possible, that we could achieve what they achieved and build on it.
And aren't they great lessons too? You know, the idea of peace and just comfortably getting along with somebody. And the other thing too is, you know, I've expressed this and you express this a lot, is unless, and I've said this before, you know, to translate it back to the border idea, you know, if the state in the political sense, the normative state is going to determine that a wall has to be here or this area has to be policed, no one logically can say that anyone actually values that being there. Because if the state is doing it, it's being done through coercion. So no one has been allowed to express his values. And the only way that one can do that is with private property. I have this piece of property. This is how high I want my wall. I don't want any wall. I'll have a gate here. I won't have a gate here. I'll have a hedgerow. I will allow X number of people on. I will not allow X number of people on. But here, if it's the state, of course, we get into the tragedy of the commons, where everybody's going to be arguing over where should the border be? How high should it be? How should it be policed? Not sufficient, not. And of course, what about how you're going to treat the people that you're going to manhandle? Are you going to invade people's farms in Laredo? What else are you going to do? Are you going to snatch people off the streets near Tufts University simply because she posted a letter in the school paper favoring peace in Palestine? I mean, so it all breaks down. It gets so insane that, and literally you're dealing with things that you never thought you would have to discuss, because of course it's all argued within the parameters of the state and no one can allow their valuation to be expressed. As in the market, which goes exactly to your point. When people are allowed to freely choose and decide where they want to send their money, then people can experiment. And if they fail, they fail. I remember once Jacob, one of the superiors where I was lecturing at this school, wanted me to use some government Department of Education resources in my class. And I said that I wouldn't do it. And it was a place called the Founders Academy. And former Senator Gordon Humphrey was on the board and things like that. It was it was supposed to be a pretty free market sort of a thing. And she said, why not? And I was like, because this is the Founders Academy and the Department of Education is unconstitutional. Like, of course, I'm not going to use this stuff. And she goes, well, here's an example. And it said, have the students write about an example of market failure. And I was like, well, you can stop right there. And she said, why? I said, because the market doesn't fail. It incorporates failure within it in order to allow other people to see the examples of someone who fails, so they can see what the problem was and either avoid it or improve on that. And then consumers can avoid it too. You have to have failure to free up usable resources. And so she was my superior, and she didn't even understand what I was talking about. And it was an amazing thing to consider how, as you say, at that time, they were able to experiment. And yes, you're right. There were things that were popping up like the Sherman Antitrust Act and things like that. But I think learning about those time periods, and I hope you'll write more about those. That would be terrific to have conversations with you about what you're discovering, because, and I want to talk to you about JFK as well, because these are segments that I hope to start to do in the midday live sometimes. And the amount of writing that you've done on these things, I think it would serve a lot of people to read these parallel to some of these history books so that they can see these things. And I don't know how it is nowadays with education and whether or not homeschoolers can utilize these sorts of resources, but to be able to pass that on to younger people, I think it does great respect to those people from those other eras. And that would be wonderful. So I hope when you have more that you'll share that with us.
Well, yeah, I'd like to, because to me it's such an exciting time. And your point about failure within the market is so true, because I've been watching these YouTube videos about the failure of, let's say, RCA that had this huge sound business, speakers and turntables, and I mean they essentially monopolized the market. But because they got arrogant and complacent, they lost market share to competitors.
Right.
And they ended up going bankrupt. And it's the same with all these other inventions where the Americans were really monopolizing this trade. And then the Japanese come along unexpectedly and start competing at a better level. And all of a sudden they find themselves out of business, the American company. It's really and that's what you're talking about. It's the failure to satisfy consumers. You don't need a Sherman Antitrust Act. You don't need to worry about these natural monopolies and so forth. The market is a great redistributor of wealth and a great humbler of people.
It's amazing. It's just great. Sometime we'll have to talk about the antitrust mentality, and great books like Dominic Armentano's work on antitrust and monopoly. I've told people, Jacob, when I worked at Star Trek, I used to read that book on the bus going from Pasadena, Colorado Boulevard down to the Paramount Studios. I'd be reading that and trying to write on it as the bus jiggled and so on. It was crazy. And I've always wanted to talk to Professor Armentano to compliment him on his work on that. And I think it's a wonderful thing to be able to learn how things like what they call vertical and horizontal integration are just arbitrary decisions that I don't like the way you're doing business, so I'm going to go after you for it using a legal mechanism, and I'm going to stretch the meaning of the Interstate Commerce Clause. And also, Jacob, one final thing I'd like to talk to you about sometime is the idea of incorporation within the United States framework and the Constitution. And I think a lot of contemporary leftists feel justified. I don't know if you agree with this, but I have a lot of friends who are leftists, and they've been very anti-corporate for a long time. And I think they're showing that they're saying, see, we were right. We're getting a fascist system here. And I'd like to go to the root of things. I've gotten a lot of books on the old guilds from Europe and the origins of the corporation. I'm doing a lot of research on that. I haven't really spoken about it yet because I want to understand it better. But the idea of granting a business or group of business people incorporation status, even within that, corporations still have to compete with each other. But I think it would be good to be able to address some of the things that the leftists have to say about corporations, because I think they use that as an entry point to get into the David versus Goliath. We've got to tax people because they're rich because of corrupt means. You know what I mean? I don't know if that.
Yeah, are you raising the idea of the corporation being an entity of the state, a creature of the state?
Yeah,
that's always bothered me as well, because it clearly was to limit liability of investors in a business. Yeah. And I think it certainly was conducive to the growth of many of these businesses that I'm talking about in the late 1800s, where people could invest their money in the stock and of an upstart company and make a fortune, but have their liability limited to what they had invested. But my hunch is that the market would have developed methods to do a stock ownership company, even absent the state intervention. And I don't know how that would have worked out, but I think the market would have developed the mechanism to do that, because it clearly is conducive to huge growth of certain businesses. And I would assume that you could figure out ways, the market would figure out ways to limit liability. And if people don't want to deal with that corporation, at least in a contractual sense, they don't have to. The tort sense is a little bit more problematic. If somebody commits a tort, that's something different. While you were talking, I was thinking one of these other examples, and that was Kodak. It was a fascinating story, and I would invite everybody to watch the history of Kodak on YouTube, because they have multiple videos there. But Kodak had monopolized the whole film industry. Yeah. I mean, it was incredible that I forget the name of the city that they were, Rochester, New York. The whole city of Rochester revolved around Kodak.
Wow.
And it was just huge. They had like 90% of the film market. And one day, a young guy they hired came in and said, "Hey, I've invented a digital camera." And they said, "Shut your mouth." They locked up the digital camera. They said, "Never talk about it again," because it was a threat to their well-established film industry. This is what these old crusty guys had done. So in the meantime, the Japanese start coming out with digital cameras, and Kodak ends up going into bankruptcy. They lose everything. Rochester is totally dilapidated because of this. It shows you the dynamics of the market economy. Yeah. It'll bring the high and the mighty down all by itself, Guard.
Yep, absolutely. And it's a wonderful thing to be able to see these developments. And like we said, people need to be able to learn from these mistakes. And when government gets in and subsidizes, whether it's a Chrysler bailout or a GM bailout or whatever, the rent seeking is there. And I think if we talk about occupations, if we talk about invasions, the state is the ultimate occupier. The state is the ultimate invader, whether it's invading our time or our intentions, our plans, our bank accounts. And as Orwell said, those few cubic centimeters remaining inside our skulls are wonderful, fertile places. And if we can only communicate with each other through talking and through the market, it's a wonderful thing, and you make me feel a little bit of that sense that I got of the golden days and the bright futures, at least intellectually for me, that there are those golden days ahead of me, because it's difficult to deal with a lot of these stories all the time. You think about these personal stories about the immigrants and bloodthirsty maniacs around the world, and just using that language it's tough. But there are some wonderful breezes and beautiful, beautiful flowers along the route. And thank you for doing what you're doing. I know this is sort of a closeout thing, but I really appreciate it, Jacob. It's awesome. It's really great.
You're welcome, and thank you. But you make a really valuable point that needs to be really emphasized. And our American ancestors in 1776 and really throughout the 1800s understood this principle. The biggest threat to our freedom and well-being is not Russia, Ukraine, China, the terrorists, the Muslims, the communists, Cuba, Iran. The biggest threat to our freedom and well-being is the U.S. government. And that's what people have to constantly keep in mind. That's what guided that Constitution, the enactment of it in 1791. That's why they limited the powers. That's why our American ancestors demanded the enactment of the Bill of Rights, because they understood what you just stated, Guard. That's the important point that everybody has to keep in mind if they want to live in a free society one of these days.
And you know, those dynamics that you experienced as a younger guy, seeing as a child, seeing the invasion of your property, those dynamics are a continuation of the dynamics of what Jefferson experienced and what Madison wrote about at that time. And it's the same sort of fluid dynamics, I'll say, of, you know, those winds still blow. And so, yeah, we'll just keep carrying on. This is great. I love it. And awesome. I can't wait. Yeah, I can't wait to do more writing on this. This is just terrific. I want to get some of the books done. As you know, I'm working on the immigration one. So we'll see how this all goes. And we got to talk to you about JFK as well down the line.
It'd be an honor and a pleasure anytime. I always have such a good time on your show, man. Thanks for the mind meld. Headache's gone away. Thank you, Guard. It's always an honor and a pleasure.
My pleasure. Absolutely. And thanks for forming one of the most consistently pro-freedom organizations in the history of this country. Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you.
Got it. Live long and prosper.
How do you do that?
I don't know. I had to put elastics on my fingers when I was a kid. Take care, Jacob. Thanks. Okay, take care. Oh, that's awesome. He's a good man. Jacob is a good man. Thanks, everybody. And we will get back to some of your comments and so on, and we'll check in on that Cuba question as Cuba Gooding Jr. question, as Karen brought up, but we're going to go with our quick close-off theme. And feel free if you have any comments. If we missed anything, I apologize. We're going to go with our Mind Meld base and come back.